thank you, Mark. And I want to thank the Nantucket Hotel and Remain Nantucket for making this happen. Caroline and Scott for working with the group to get me here. And I'll tell you, we're loving it. My wife is with me, and we had to come a day early, which is not so bad. And I don't mind this weather because I'm actually just hanging out and doing nothing. And that's not a bad thing. I really don't mind that. And we're really enjoying being back in Nantucket. I used to come here, as you'll see, quite a bit. And I don't anymore because of these critters and other stuff that I'm working on. But I love to come back, and it's such a wonderful, wonderful island for me to visit. And you know, and it's great because I lived on the vineyard. Don't boo, but I lived on the vineyard for many years, and both islands are just, you know, so into the ocean, and people who live there do so because of the ocean. And I loved being on the island. I loved visiting Nantucket, and the ocean inspires me. So what I usually like to do is tell people a little bit about how I got to where I am, particularly if there's kids in the room who ultimately want to become marine scientists. And I have kind of an unusual start in terms of where I grew up. I grew up in a Connecticut suburb of New York, and I'm one of 7. So these are all my brothers and sisters. And you can see I'm not a young person because this is a black and white photo, and color photos weren't around then. And so but I grew up on Long Island Sound, which for those of us who grew up in that area back then, it wasn't the most pristine body of water. So much of what I did as a child in terms of being inspired to play with the ocean, to go in the ocean, came from a fellow by the name of Jacques Cousteau. And I'm sure a few people in the room here might remember this character. He was an early explorer and scientist, filmmaker, underwater cameraman, and very, very popular, bringing the ocean to life on our television every week. And so I was inspired by him, and I would go to places like the New England Aquarium. So I'd go all the way from southern Connecticut to Boston to see the aquarium back in the 70s, and I had aquariums in my home, and it was all about bringing the fish to me, and occasionally going in Long Island Sound. But then this great movie came out in 1975, and that's the year I graduated from middle school. And I was inspired by a character in the film by the name of Matt Hooper, and I decided at a pretty young age that I wanted to be a marine biologist. And so I went to the University of Rhode Island, and I studied marine biology and various other disciplines, and ultimately started working in 1983 at a lab in Narragansett, Rhode Island, of the National Marine Fisheries Service, so a federal agency. And this particular group studied sharks, the natural history and ecology and movements of sharks. And because there was no job available, I started by volunteering. So volunteering is such a great thing to do. And it worked out for me because when a job opened up to be a technician in this particular program, I was hired immediately. So here's one of my first research cruises. I'm the guy on the far, far left. And this is a big tiger shark. And I like to show this photo because it kind of points to how technology has evolved over the course of my almost 40-year career. A lot of what we knew about sharks came from studying dead sharks. So my master's degree was looking at dead animals. A lot of the folks I was working with at the time were doing necropsies on dead sharks. And we did do tagging, but it was very simple, conventional tagging, putting markers on animals and hoping those animals would be recaptured in the future and we can learn about their movements. But most of it came from cutting up dead sharks. So a lot of my early research was looking at dead fish. And you can learn a lot from a dead fish. You know, if you look at its stomach, some of it's very obvious. You look at its stomach, you can see what it ate. Some of it's not so obvious, like taking the backbone of a shark and cutting it out and examining rings on the backbone to come up with its age and therefore its growth rate. And that was what I did for my master's degree. But you don't learn a lot about the behavior of these animals by looking at dead fish. In 1987, I was hired by the Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries, and I still work for them. And I was the regional biologist for Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard Islands. It was a brand new position that was established then, and I was working for a guy who said to me, "Greg, create your job." And that never happens anymore, you know, as a scientist. So I moved to the vineyard in 1987, and we lived there until 2010. But because my region included Nantucket, I would run a boat back and forth between the islands. And because I was also doing a lot of work with big fish and trying to establish a large pelagics research program that focused on sharks, tunas, marlins, and such, I'd also go to fishing tournaments that targeted those things. And of course, the Nantucket Anglers Club used to have big fishing tournament, multiple tournaments that targeted big fish. So a lot of my early encounters on Nantucket was crashing around the docks, and some of you in the room may have seen me back then. Very young Greg Skomel, taking notes and learning about the species that occurred here by examining your catch. And there I am on the docks of Nantucket with a tuna fish. And so I persisted as a scientist, a regional biologist for many, many years, all while developing this interest in sharks. But most of my research was on other species of sharks, others meaning non-white sharks. And that included upper left sand tiger, the smooth dogfish below that, big mako shark on the lower left, that's the world record mako shark. Blue shark's the most common large shark, the porbeagle, which is below that, center. And then I did some research on basking sharks, which is this big fish right here. A lot of work on basking sharks using newer technologies. And I got to collaborate with people all over the world, and a couple of good examples of that are gray reef sharks in the Pacific Ocean, as well as Greenland sharks up in the Arctic Circle, diving under 6 feet of ice and trying to follow their movements using new acoustic technology, which I'll talk about more and more as we go into this talk. And so I got to focus on all these different shark species, but the holy grail to shark biologists, of course, is to get an opportunity to study white sharks. Because after all, the white shark is the pinnacle of all sharks, and probably arguably the most charismatic animal on the planet. It drives our attention, and it's surrounded by myth and mystery. And so a lot of the questions that you all have about sharks are the same questions that we have as scientists. You know, when, where, how, all those kinds of things. And that's what we'll try to talk about as we move through this talk. But what did we know about white sharks historically? And that was largely based on the capture of white sharks incidentally or targeted over time. And so these little green dots represent the historical database that we currently have for white shark occurrence in the western North Atlantic. And each one represents, for the most part, a fisheries interaction. So somebody capturing a white shark, reporting it, and us just putting the dot up there. So almost everything we knew about white sharks really just centered on these little green dots, which give us a general sense of their distribution. There's over 600 white shark dots here, dating back to the early 1800s. And these were assembled by a couple different papers that came out in '85 and 2014 to try to look at changes in the distribution of this species. And what you can see is it's based on this information. It's largely a coastal shark, occurring on the continental shelf all the way from Canadian waters into the Gulf of Mexico. But it doesn't tell us a lot about the behavior of these animals. It doesn't tell us what these sharks do minute to minute, day to day, year to year. It doesn't tell us about the way they interact with their environment, their ecology. And as a result, all we really knew about white sharks was their distribution, historically. But some of these green dots would come in, fishermen would bring them in, and we'd have a chance as scientists to do our necropsies. And so this is a very young white shark that was delivered to the lab in Rhode Island where I was working. And we had a chance to dissect it. It's a juvenile. It's about the size we think they're born. This is a really big white shark that was harpooned by a fisherman off the coast of New York and brought in, and we had a chance to do a necropsy on that. So we were able to get little bits and pieces from these necropsies, but for the most part, although there's 600 little green dots, that spans a very, very long time. And white shark was not a predictable animal for scientists or even fishermen to go out and catch. So it was not an animal that was easy to study. So much of what we know about white sharks globally comes from other parts of the world. And so occasionally I still dive back into necropsies, and I'm going to show you a necropsy that we did just a few years ago on a white shark that beached itself off the coast of Orleans on the Outer Cape. And so at the expense of not boring you to death, we've sped up this film to show you how a team of scientists methodically takes apart a white shark to learn about its biology. You know I work for the state of Massachusetts, so therefore I don't work this fast. But you can see the team that represents folks from academia, from the lab I used to work at, from the aquarium, others, and all looking at various tissues to try to learn as much as we can about this animal. But again, it doesn't tell us about how this animal lives from day to day. It only gives us little hints into the general natural history of the white shark. But times are changing in Cape Cod, and things are changing on Cape Cod. It wasn't until 2004, and some of you may remember this incident that occurred off Noshawn Island, one of the Elizabeth Islands off of Cape Cod to the southwest, basically very close to Woods Hole. 2004, a big female white shark swam into this salt pond and got trapped there for 2 weeks. And I was living on the vineyard, so I just drove over in my boat. And of course, I didn't believe the story that there was a big white shark swimming around in a salt pond, but it turned out to be a big white shark swimming around in a salt pond. And so the first thing I did, is we were tagging basking sharks at the time, is I put one of these very sophisticated tags called a pop-up satellite tag on that shark, hoping to be the first person to actually see what live white sharks do over a long period of time when they're not swimming around salt ponds. And so we put the tag on the shark, and to make a very long story short, because I could do a whole talk about this shark, we ultimately got the shark out of the pond using a variety of techniques, and ultimately got it out of the pond. And then the tag failed 45 minutes later. So I know, I felt really bad. I asked my wife, I had hit a low after that tag failed. So I've been looking at this tag for 2 weeks on this shark, and then it swims, we get it out, and then the tag fails and comes off. So all we learned about this particular shark is that it was swimming around a salt pond for 2 weeks. But it was a harbinger, an indicator of what was to come, because we were at the same time noticing that more and more seals were turning up on beaches on the Vineyard and the Outer Cape and Nantucket with large wounds that were fatal. And there's only really one animal that's capable of doing that in New England waters, and that is the white shark. So we started noticing seals were coming back in bigger numbers, and white sharks are coming back in bigger numbers. And one thing we've learned about from other hot spots around the world where white sharks occur in big numbers is they have something in common, and that's food that looks like this. Okay? Big white sharks, as Scott had told you, will depend on certain times of the year seals for sustenance. And that's because big white sharks can attack and kill and eat seals. They're really, really capable of it. Very small white sharks are perfectly adapted for chasing around fish. Big white sharks get bulky, they get heavy, their tooth shape changes from a sharply pointed tooth, which is good for fish, to a cutting tool, serrated, that's well adapted for biting and killing and gouging their prey. And that's exactly what they do. So white sharks in excess of 8-9 feet long go through this pubescent phase where they become big, bulky seal eaters. And so what are we seeing on Cape Cod? We're seeing the restoration of seal populations. And if you put this much food on a beach, you're going to attract something that eats it. And that's exactly what's happening now. You know, there's a tendency for us to think in terms of what else is changing environmentally when it comes to this phenomenon, but really it's as simple as there's a big prey base that's been established, and the white shark population, which is also rebounding on the eastern seaboard of the United States, is taking advantage of it. It has the capacity to attack and kill and forage on these seals. And so we are seeing this unfold before our eyes on the Outer Cape. And it's an amazing phenomenon to witness. This is one of the aerial photos by Wayne Davis, who's a spotter pilot that works very closely with me on finding white sharks that we tag. We'll talk more about that in a second. So this is a seal that's a smart seal. This is a seal that realizes that big fish behind me is not going to be able to catch me if I swim into shallow water, and that's exactly what it's doing. And that shark has turned on the speed, it's got the turbo on, and you can see the weight that it's leaving in an effort to get to that seal. This seal survived. It made it to the beach. This seal did not learn from the other seal's experience and did not make it. And so I'm going to show you a footage of one of these incidents that we came upon on the Outer Cape after a shark had attacked and killed a seal. And you would think with thousands of seals on the Outer Cape and hundreds of white sharks, we would see this every day. And remarkably, we do not. We put some nice music to it. I don't know if you can hear that. This is our tagging vessel, which I'll talk about in a second. This shark has killed the seal, and it kills them very quickly if it has a good strike. What the shark really likes is the thick blubber layer that these seals have. White sharks also scavenge whales. They love that bacon on the whale. It is rich in energy. And so the white shark will target the whale blubber as well as the seal blubber. And there are estimates that the white shark, if it eats a seal, will be okay, won't have to feed again theoretically for 30 to 60 days. Now, that doesn't mean they necessarily do that, all right? If a white shark is very successful on preying upon seals, it will stay in the area and continue to do that because it's going to bulk up in doing so. And so we do not see a lot of those predation events, unfortunately. What we are seeing is the fact that these sharks are hunting very, very close to shore. All right, so this is just along the outer cape. This is a white shark in close proximity. These seals adapt to the presence of these sharks. So it's really interesting to work on this particular aspect of it because you've got the predator going after the prey and the prey trying not to get eaten. And so this choreography of predator-prey reaction is really interesting how the seals adapt to the presence of this top predator. But what else is happening in these very same waters is there's people. So we've got, the human interaction aspect of this, which Scott talked about. And for those of you who have spent any time in this area, you know that the number of incidents between sharks and people are going up and have gone up on a relative scale over the course of the last decade. And so our prior to 2018, our last fatal shark attack was off the coast of Mattapoisett in Buzzards Bay back in 1936. And that attack was here. Okay, then we had a series of events that occurred. A swimmer was bitten in 2012 off Truro. It was non-fatal. 2 kayakers were out looking, believe it or not, for white sharks near a seal colony. And a white shark struck the kayak with such force that knocked both occupants into the water. The girls were unharmed, but the shark bit right through the kayak. And that was off of Plymouth. We had a paddleboard bitten in 2017 off of Wellfleet, and that paddleboarder was not injured, but upset, to say the least. In 2018, Dr. Litton was bitten off Truro severely. It was non-fatal, and then we had a fatal shark attack on a bodyboarder in 2018 off of Wellfleet. And so the number of incidents is going up. And as you can imagine, people are taking notice. Visitors are taking notice. Cape Cod is taking notice. Business owners, Chamber of Commerce, everybody is thinking about this issue, and perhaps even here on Nantucket as well as the Vineyard. And so what are we doing as scientists in order to try to get a sense of what these animals do when they're in these shallow waters? And I think, from a scientific perspective, it's a better understanding of predatory behavior. When a shark bites a person, it is making a mistake. It is going after what it perceives is a prey item, i.e. a seal. These sharks are hunting seals in shallow water close to beaches, and people are in those areas. So I think if we can understand when, where, and how white sharks feed on their prey, we'll be better equipped to provide information to beach managers and the general public that will be helpful to enhance public safety. The bottom line really is the probability of a shark attack is really, really low. When the media calls me, or the average individual calls me and says, Greg, I'm going to the beach today, what do? I always say, drive safely. Because you know what? The chances of you being hurt in your car is so much higher. But all it takes is one shark bite and people really freak out, and I understand that. I absolutely understand it. So we have going on right now is a shark going after its prey, the seal, and people going into that mix. So the rest of this talk is really going to focus on what we're doing to get a better understanding of predatory behavior so we can produce information that's going to be helpful to enhance public safety while preserving this natural ecosystem which we've worked so hard to bring back. So a lot of this involves tagging. All right, we've been tagging white sharks since 2009. Admittedly, when we first started tagging, I was very much interested in when they arrived in Cape Cod, when they left Cape Cod, and where they went on the broader scale. I was interested in the status of the population, what we needed to do to further conserve it or to protect it, and I wasn't so much focused on public safety, how to enhance public safety. But I have to admit, I'm doing that now, and I never thought I would when I started studying sharks because of the low probability of these events. But now we're focused on turning our tagging efforts into generating information that's going to be far more useful at finer scales. And so what we need to do is, instead of studying what these sharks are doing from year to year or even month to month, I'm drilling down to what they might be doing every minute or every second of their existence, to know how they're behaving and what in these shallow waters and how they're going about their daily activities of feeding on fish. So we'll talk about the techniques of the types of tags we're using, but I want to show you how we go about tagging, because what we've done is we're really focusing on using the least invasive technique we possibly can to place tags on these animals. For the last 75 years, the most effective tag is just a small intramuscular dart inserted at the base of the dorsal fin. Right? Typically, we get fishermen to do it for us when it came to conventional tagging. We do it when it comes to more sophisticated tagging because the tags are a lot more expensive and we're targeting certain animals. So what we want the shark to be doing is just going about its business, swimming around, exhibiting normal behavior, and then we'll place the tag while it's free swimming. What we're trying not to do is anything that's going to be too invasive. So here's a situation where we've got me on the pulpit of our boat, and we use the pulpit so we can get out ahead of the boat, so we don't spook. The same reason pulpits are on tuna fishing boats and on and sword fishing harpoon boats, because you get out and you don't spook the fish. And you can see the shadow of the shark down below me. And what I've done is I've taken video of that shark using a GoPro, which didn't exist a bunch of years ago. And now we're just getting ready, hoping this shark swims by, and I'm just going to place that dart right there at the base of the dorsal fin. And you'll get another view of it right here. And the tag, I believe, is colored blue. Yeah, so there's the tag on the shark, and that's an acoustic tag. And so what we're trying not to do is capture the shark, drag the shark. Always excitement when we tag a shark. And because I don't, the ultimate goal when you tag any animal is not to modify its behavior, because then you're not studying natural behavior. We want to study natural behavior, so we want to be as least invasive as possible. So we've been applying tags since 2009, most of them the last 5 years. And we're up to 230 white sharks tagged off the coast of the Outer Cape, as well as parts of South Carolina where we're doing work down on their overwintering grounds. And we're using multiple technologies. These are 3 general technologies. I'll focus mostly on these acoustic tags, which is really a great tool for looking at local movements. And then we'll talk a little bit about the pop-up satellite and the real-time satellite tags. That will give us a sense of what the animal's doing over broader scales. Where do they go? No single tag technology is the silver bullet. So you use multiple technologies because each one answers different questions. There is a tendency among some scientists that as soon as a new technology comes out, you just got to use it. You absolutely have to use it because it's brand new and it's the coolest new toy. But we have to always take a step back and think, okay, what are the questions we're trying to answer here? What's the best way to spend this money? Because the tags have different price tags. The conventional tag that was used for 50 years and is still used cost about $2, all right? The acoustic tag you see here is about $400. The more sophisticated satellite tags are in the range of about $4,000. So you have to be very selective in how you apply these tags. And where have we seen white sharks along the outer cape, which is our primary study area? Where have we seen them? This is where we've seen them. Okay? This is where, can you find a spot where we have not seen white sharks along the outer cape? Now, you say to yourself, well, boy, they don't go into Nantucket Sound and they're not going to Cape Cod Bay, and then I tell you that these are the bounds of our study area. And we're bounded because we don't have unlimited funding and we don't have unlimited personnel. We've expanded into Cape Cod Bay. But also the technology we're using allows us to go to these other areas through the eyes of the shark and the behavior of the shark, and not necessarily by having to go out there ourselves. And that's what we're getting to. We're getting away from effort-dependent type of work. So this is where white sharks occur along the outer cape. And when are they there? That's the number one question I get from people, particularly surfers. When are the white sharks here? And so we can look at our acoustic detection data. So this is what the acoustic tag does. You just saw me put an acoustic tag in a white shark. What the acoustic tag does is it emits a very high frequency sound. And that sound is picked up by an acoustic receiver that you see on the left side of the screen. And the closer the shark gets to the receiver, the more likely it's going to be detected. That range is generally on the order of 100 to 200 meters. So the shark is fairly close to that receiver. When the receiver detects it, decodes who that shark is. Each one of these tags is individually coded like a serial number. Detects the shark and does a time and date stamp. So that shark was there on Sunday afternoon at 2 p.m. We then go back, collect the data from all the receivers, and we can figure out where the sharks spend their time. So when do they arrive? When do they leave? Where do they spend their time? Any particular habitats? But the data are only as good as your acoustic receiver array. And what you're going to learn here is I've done a really poor job in getting receivers out on Nantucket, because that's all what you're really interested in. How many of these white sharks are coming to Nantucket? We've gotten receivers out here. We've lost a lot of receivers out here. Maintaining them has been challenging logistically, and Scott and I and others are working hard to get more receivers out here. But it gives you a great look over multiple years for individual sharks at their behavior and residency. And what's really nice is these tags, if I can keep them on the shark, will last 9 or 10 years. So we can follow individuals from year to year to year. So when we look at seasonality, we just have to plot our acoustic detection data. Take all the receivers that we've got out there, we've got about 100, and we plot our data and we see that the sharks really are not here in June, don't arrive until late June. July they will start ramping up, but really our peak months are August, September, and October. The sharks don't leave because the kids go back to school. I think the newspaper thinks that, but that's not true, okay? The sharks are still here in October in big numbers. And they really don't drop off until we get into November. We start getting those cold nor'easters, and the storms are moving through, and then we start pulling our receivers generally in late December and January to make sure we've captured the full season. And so there's a very distinct seasonality. Although the seals are here and are here in larger numbers during the winter months, the sharks are not. The sharks, although they can elevate their body temperature, they're unique in that way, they still can't tolerate our winters, and so they have to leave. So the guys and gals who like to go out and surf in the wintertime love this distinct seasonality. So where do they spend their time when they're in Massachusetts? These are not white sharks, okay? These little red dots are acoustic receivers, okay? The little receivers that we put out to detect tagged fish. And I say fish because it's not just white sharks. When you see a receiver way up inside Boston Harbor, or a receiver way up the Taunton River, we're not looking for white sharks necessarily. The Boston Harbor stuff is work we're doing with the New England Aquarium. Jeff Kneebone, who was my student, now works for the Anderson Cabot Center, doing great work on sand tigers and other species. So great collaborative efforts with the aquarium, and we're looking at sand tiger movements. That big array you see up in Massachusetts Bay was for codfish work we're doing, looking at cod spawning areas. And just because these tags are on cod, sharks, striped bass, doesn't mean that the receivers don't pick up. It's great technology for looking at multiple species using our waters. Most of these receivers here are the ones that we've put out for white sharks, including those up into Buzzards Bay, Nantucket Sound. So these are all the receivers we have ever had over time out there, right? Which includes the Great Point receivers and a whole bunch we had around Muskegon Island, where you'd think these white sharks would be spending all their time, right? Because that's where there's lots and lots of seals. So this next graphic I'm going to put up is going to be which receivers detect white sharks, and the size of the receiver dot will be proportional to the number of white sharks that they detect. Okay, so the bigger the dot, the more white sharks that are detected. Okay, so these big bubbles that you see here on these outer Cape receivers means that the bulk of our sharks are spending their time over the course of the summer along the outer Cape, the inner part of Cape Cod Bay, and then the numbers diminish as you work your way north. Not to say they don't exist off the South Shore, but these are mostly sharks that are transient, moving up into the Gulf of Maine, working along the shoreline. You see these dots are really small around Nantucket, but that is deceptive, okay? That doesn't mean you don't get more numbers of white sharks, because every year Scott sends me lots of photos of seals that are bitten up by white sharks, so they are spending time out here. This is more of an artifact of the fact that I can't keep receivers out here for any great length of time without them disappearing, storms taking them out, and without having the logistics to maintain them. So for those of you in the room who have boats who want to work with us, I can pay you to put these receivers out and bring them back in. I want to know more about what's happening, particularly along this eastern shoreline of Nantucket, because I know they're spending more time out here. So we get a sense of where they spend their time using these acoustic detection data. This, unfortunately, is a graphic that is not working, but it would show you, if you could see it, all these little dots moving around individual white sharks along just the 1 week in the life of multiple white sharks off the coast of Cape Cod. And you'd see the dots going from receiver to receiver, which are the white dots. And you can see some real residency. We have sharks that will move through and treat Cape Cod like it's a rest stop on I-95 on their way to Canada. We have others that will actually get a hotel room and hang out for the entire season, gorging themselves on the seals. And so we're seeing individual behavioral traits emerge from these white sharks over the course of time. And I'll give you some examples of that. First and foremost, I will tell you I do not name the sharks. I did name James, but not Lumpy and Cool Beans. Those are named by folks who sponsor our research. But these are 3 graphics that are called heat maps. So you're going to have hot and cold areas on these maps. And what these maps are going to tell you is where each one of these individuals likes to spend his or her time. All right, so what I want you to look for on the outer Cape here are these hot spots. Those are the neighborhoods, the territories of that particular individual. So you can see that James is really, really into the Chatham area. Spends almost the entire summer in that area, very rarely, if ever, going north or south of that when he is in the Cape area. And Lumpy is kind of interesting as well, only he prefers Monomoy. All right, so Lumpy is a shark that prefers to be in the Monomoy region, not overlapping much at all with James, which would tell us that there's individual behavioral traits that might be indicative of territorial behavior. These are both large, what we think dominant white sharks that reside off Cape Cod for the entire season. Cool Beans, however, not so selective. Right? Tends to avoid the region where James and Lumpy hangs out, all right? But certainly not afraid to go throughout the entire Cape. So this might not be a dominant animal, just moving around, picking off seals where it can throughout the territories or sneaking into the other territories of other white sharks. So we have these really interesting individual behaviors that these sharks are demonstrating. And that's really unusual from a fisheries biologist point of view. We tend to say, this is what striped bass do, this is what codfish do, this is what perch do. But now we have individual striped bass doing individual things in the case of white sharks, right? Individual sharks, so generalizing as to what the species is doing becomes far more challenging in looking at these data sets and seeing these individual behavioral traits. Some of the acoustic receivers we put out last year, we've modified so that we don't have to go back and get the data. Instead, we've got a receiver out floating in the water that will transmit those detections almost immediately to us through a cell phone system. And so what we did, and this is the case, this is where Arthur Medici was killed in 2018 by a white shark. This is Newcomb Hollow Beach in Wellfleet. We placed this, and the cell phone was with a lifeguard tower. So anytime a white shark swam within the range of one of these receivers, and it had to be a tagged white shark. And as much as I think I'm good at tagging, I don't think I've tagged them all. So anytime it swam within the range of the receiver would send a message to the lifeguard, and the lifeguard would then act accordingly. So we tested this technology out to see if it would be useful to the lifeguards, and they actually loved it. And they actually got a lot of attention from beachgoers too, because the shark would swim close, and we gave the catalog of white sharks also to the lifeguard. So the lifeguard would say to the beachgoers, hey, James just swam by, you know, or whoever, Lumpy's here, or Cool Beans, or whoever, you know. And so then the people on the beach would actually get engaged and liked it, but what they found out was this receiver was pinging constantly to the lifeguards. And those were just the tagged sharks. But it allows them to think, okay, do we pull people from the water every time a shark pings? How long do we keep them out of the water? How many times do we do that a day? I mean, it got them thinking about the kinds of steps they have to take as public safety officials. And so we're going to use more of this technology next year in other parts of Cape Cod to get a sense, because a lot of other towns have stepped forward saying, you know, we know you haven't tagged every shark, but we want to get a feel for how often these sharks are here. And so this real-time technology is now available. And of course the big question, so we know when they're here, we know where they spend their time, but how do they actually hunt the seals? And this is a lot harder question to answer, because we're not on the water all the time, and even when we are on the water 40 times a year, we don't see as many predation events as you would think. You know, I've shown you some photos of predation events, and we've had some really interesting predation events that we have seen. And we're learning from these events. This is a photo again by Wayne Davis, and this is an incident that occurred a couple of years ago. He called us over because a white shark was swimming back and forth off this small group of seals that was really tight. Those were the smart seals. They know that if they stay really close to the shoreline, and they figure this out generally by mid to late July, for those who are new to the game, the white sharks can't get to them, even though they're very, very close. But this particular seal didn't get the memo that day. And so we came over with the boat. Wayne was flying. He said, there's this shark going back and forth. So from under the boat, though, in comes this much smaller seal. And this is the moment, this photograph's great. This is the moment that the shark sees the seal and the seal sees the shark. Now, how many people think this is a dead seal? I thought at that moment that this was a dead seal. The next photo that Wayne took is this one, okay? This is actually the seal knowing it only had one option, and that is to go straight out of the water, up in the air. Jumps out of the water, and the shark says, well, I can do that too. And the shark follows it. And you can actually see in this photo the seal on top of the shark, and the shark's jaws closing in an attempt to get to the seal, and completely missing. Right? So I happen to be holding a GoPro at the end of this. So I'll show you this video as we captured it. And you probably saw this before because it went viral for some strange reason. But it really was, we very rarely had ever seen a white shark breach in this Cape Cod area because the water is so shallow. So for those of you who missed it, we're going to slow it down and you'll get to see it again. Here's the seal coming straight out of the water right here, and the shark going up after it. Now the seal makes it to the beach and never goes back in the water again. So just a couple years ago, though, we had another very similar experience where we saw another breach. And I have to tell you, this one was a little bit closer to home. If you haven't seen this, I commend you, because it means you don't have a computer, and that's not a bad thing. So Wayne Davis is in the air telling me there's a white shark somewhere below us. The water is extremely murky, so I'm going to try to videotape this shark, and the shark comes to me. So again, for those, that happens really, really fast, but I want you to see not only the white shark come up toward the pulpit after me, but my really interesting dance that I invented right there. That was like a split second, so I didn't think anything of it until this video was on TV, and I kept watching it over and over again and realizing that that wasn't a very comfortable position to be in. So we see this occasional breaching behavior even in very, very, very shallow water, but we only have seen probably less than 20 incidents where white sharks attack and kill seals. So to find any kind, and for you scientists in the room, you know that a sample size of 20 or less is not very good when it comes to trying to find patterns in behavior over fine scales. And so we're going to try some newer technologies. Now, I've already talked about the acoustic technology. And so this is our acoustic receiver array in 2019. And as you can see, conspicuously missing are the receivers off Nantucket, which again, we're trying to solve that issue. And so what we've decided to do is focus on an area off of Truro, known as Head of the Meadow Beach. And this is an area that we've decided to put a very intensive acoustic receiver array. It has a sizable haul out of seals that is consistently there. So we know the white sharks are targeting them. We know from our other acoustic data in the region that the white sharks are there all summer. And so what we've decided to do is set up an array gridded that looks like this, over about 1 mile by half a mile. We're doing this with this Provincetown Center for Coastal Studies. And what we're trying to do is also map the area. The center is mapping it. So the color you see here is the depths in the region. And so we're trying to look at the individual movements of these animals as it relates to the habitat. Are they going over the sandbars? Are they going between the sandbars? What do they do at high tide? What do they do at low tide? So just imagine, this is hypothetical, a white shark swimming through this array will be able to triangulate its exact position and compare that to the habitat in the area as that habitat changes over the course of the year and with major storm events. So linking the shark's behavior to the habitat hopefully will allow us to look at the length of Cape Cod and other areas to see where the sharks are most likely to be at certain times of the day. And so it's another way for us to get at this fine-scale behavioral information. The other technology we're using, and this is another project in conjunction with the New England Aquarium, is we're using acceleration data loggers. One of their scientists, in my opinion, is a pioneer in the use of acceleration data loggers. Acceleration data loggers are the latest and greatest technology for looking at really, really fine scale. When I say fine scale behavior, I mean every second what that animal is doing in terms of its posture, its movement, its place in the water column, the temperature and depth. In other words, I know if that shark is swimming fast, swimming slowly, swimming high, swimming low, and when it turns, when it doesn't turn, when it might be resting versus when it might be attacking and killing. And you can put these data loggers on the shark for multiple days and get multiple data sets. You end up with millions of data bits, which is really fun if you're a scientist, but really difficult if you're an old scientist like me and don't know how to work with giant data sets. And that's why I partner with brilliant young minds like Nick Whitney at the aquarium. So what you see here is a prototype of one of these tags. It's a towable tag, and what's really cool about this one is it also has a camera and lighting system in it. So at night the lights come on and you can film what the shark is actually doing. So when it decides to zigzag in the water column, you can see that in the data set, and then you can also compare it to what the tag is seeing, so what the shark is actually doing, to come up with behavioral states. So we can look at how often the shark may be feeding, what time of day, where it might be, what the tide is, and start looking at some of those environmental parameters that are driving the behaviors of these animals. So here's one of those tags, and I leveraged Discovery Channel, my friends at Discovery Channel, to build and buy these tags for us. They're very, very expensive, and I've been very lucky to strong-arm Discovery to pay for a lot of our research. So what you see here is a long-term acoustic tag that I placed in the shark, tethered to one of these camera tags that also has the accelerometer in it. And what these tags will do is this will detach, the tag will float to the surface, and I'll retrieve it after 1, 2, or 3 days. So we get these tags back. They collect so much data that they can't be transmitted through a satellite. So I'm going to show you a data set, and it's a really boring data set until I hopefully point out to you what we're actually looking for. This is the depth of that shark over the course of just a few minutes, all right? What the shark is doing in three-dimensional space, up and down in the water column. As you can see, it's very active in the water column, moving between the surface and about 75 feet deep over the course of just a few minutes. And this is its acceleration in 3 different dimensions. And all I want you to look for here is what we think is normal swimming behavior as the tail of the shark goes back and forth very, very slowly. And then these unusual events, these acceleration events in 3 different planes, X, Y, and Z, 3 dimensions. So we're looking for these acceleration events. And then what we can do is hopefully look at what the shark might be doing during one of these events. So I'll show you some actual footage from this shark during one of these events. And you're going to say, boy, I don't see a heck of a lot, and you don't. But eventually we will. Right? This is the view from right in the back of the shark. We used to use grad students for this. We don't anymore. You can see the bottom. Now the shark is suddenly going to accelerate. Boom. We don't know why it accelerated, but now we can compare that acceleration to what we're seeing in that data set. I'll show you another one. And this other video we pulled, and I just pulled these from our data set, has a bit more of an acceleration, which I think might be associated with a predation attempt. Because the shark surges toward the surface, you'll be able to see the surface of the water. So here's again, that's the acoustic tag. We just tagged the shark. The shark is now accelerating toward the surface. You can see the surface. You can actually see the gills of the shark flare, which means it's opening its mouth. So it's attempting, we think, to go after something. And now it settles back out again and rests. These are short bursts. And sharks don't do short bursts unless they're motivated to do that. Either get away from something or go after something, because it costs energy, and energy is expensive. And so we're using these data sets in an attempt to figure out when, where, and how white sharks are feeding on their prey. And I'll end the talk with this because I haven't been including this in recent talks, but people then come up to me afterwards and say, where do they go when they leave here? And so we've been using the satellite technology. Now remember my first slide with all the little green dots. And those green dots basically said the sharks occur from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico, and they're largely coastal. They're shelf-oriented. They stay on the shallow plateau of a shelf that reaches out from our continent, and they're shelf-oriented. But one thing you've got to know about those data sets is that's generated by fishermen reporting to us. And it also reflects where the fishermen, where they might be fishing. And so as soon as we started using the more sophisticated tag technology, which is fisheries independent data set, we started realizing that the white shark is not just a coastal shark. It has an oceanic phase to its natural history. So if we depended solely on little green dots, we were getting it wrong. Now using the new technologies, we're seeing that the movements of the white shark are far more oceanic in nature. It has a pelagic aspect to its life, moving as far as east of the mid-Atlantic ridge, moving into the eastern Atlantic. And what's really cool about these sharks that move offshore is when they leave the shelf, they start doing these incredible dives. And I'll end with these dives. So there's the shark when it's on the continental shelf in September and October. It leaves New England early December, late November, and starts moving its way out into the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, diving to depths as great as 1,000, that's 3,000 feet, 1,000 meters every day through an incredible temperature change. That goes from super warm at the surface to very, very cold. And of course the question you have and I have is, why are you doing that? All right? There's no seals out there. What are you doing in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean diving to 3,000 feet deep through really broad temperature range? And I can't answer it. You know, if there's a scientist that stands in front of you and answers this question, he or she is making that up. I'm going to tell you that right now. Because as wonderful as these tags are, you know, they only tell us where the sharks go and not what they do, okay? And so, you know, we want to know more about this, and that's why we started inventing the AUV technology to track and spy on these sharks, which I'm not going to talk about today, but I'll happily come back at another time. But this is what they do. They move great distances into places we never thought they went to, doing things we have no idea what they're doing. And so stay tuned for additional results. I love any excuse to come back to Nantucket, including staying at this incredible hotel. And I want to thank, again, Remain Nantucket and the hotel and resort, and a number of people, including Discovery Channel, Atlantic White Shark Conservancy, which supports all of my research, my collaborators, and others. And I did not bring any books because I'm lazy, but I do have the Shark Handbook out. It's available through all the major outlets. And this is a great kids book right here about the work that we do off Cape Cod and the islands. So with that, I'll stick around for questions and drinks and anything you guys want to do. So here we have a question.
Do sharks travel in packs like coyotes?
No, sharks do not travel in packs. They're incredibly solitary animals that end up in these aggregation areas because of their food resources. And we also think that these aggregation areas might serve as a good place to make baby sharks. And so we think mating might be going on in some of these aggregations, although that's never been demonstrated. Yeah?
What's their lifespan?
Lifespan of a white shark is about 70 plus years. Yeah, we published a paper a few years ago using, again, new technology to show that they can live over 70 years, which is actually one of the oldest living fishes in terms of its longevity. And it's really messed up our growth curves, which we've come up with, which we really don't understand. But the white shark is a long-lived, definitely a long-lived shark.
You mentioned this earlier, but when you're putting those receivers out, what is the array or the radius that it gets a ping from a shark? Like, what's the furthest distance?
So what's the radius of detection, the detection range of each receiver? So it's dependent on the environment, of course, that it's in and ambient noise. If you put one in Boston Harbor, it's going to have a very low range. If you've got one, you know, quarter mile off the beach in the outer Cape, you might get, you know, 300 meters.
And so that's when it's sent to the lifeguards when it's a 300 meters.
Yeah, so the shark is detected, and the lifeguard can assume that somewhere within a 300-meter radius of that receiver out there, there's a white shark going by. Yeah. Yes.
Yes, quick question. Do you all share information with the O-Search guys as well? Or are these two separate entities? How does that?
Well, yeah, we had there's a few of our sharks. 4 of the sharks that I showed you here today, we actually tagged on O-Search back in 2012 and 13. We since moved from using that tagging technique to going to a less invasive technique.
Okay, so they bring the sharks onto the ship.
They capture the sharks, they handle them, they're able to take some blood, they're able to do some other things, but I think there's trade-offs there that I don't want to get involved in terms of the handling of these fish, particularly if you're really close to where people are swimming. So we've decided a very hands-off approach to getting tags off the sharks.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All the way back.
They attack each other to claim a territory.
Good question. Do they attack each other? I can tell you for a fact they attack each other. The scars on these animals, not only from seals, but from each other, are absolutely amazing. They'll be missing fins. they'll have fins torn in half, and they're doing it to each other, which tells me that there's clearly social interaction, probably competition, or mating attempts.
Do these sharks like travel between oceans? For example, like have you ever found an Atlantic shark being pinned off the coast of like California or Cape May?
No evidence of interoceanic travel from our fish. Yeah.
What is your hypothesis for what would make an animal dive 3,000 feet down into very cold water?
What would I make up? Why would sharks dive that deep? I mean, so well, I'll probably there's two general schools of thought. One thing that we've learned from the sharks tagged on the California and Mexican coastline is that they go to a very specific offshore focal area called the White Shark Cafe, right? Which implies that they're feeding there, even though the folks who actually coined that phrase think that the sharks are going to this area to mate. They think that they're there for reproductive purposes. Of course, the area is about the size of, Alaska. And so I don't know why an animal, if it's hanging out right along the coastline near a seal colony, would go so far to mate over such a broad area. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And then the other school of thought is there's some predictable food resource that the sharks are going to. And if you have a shark that's lived a long time, particularly during a period when the seal populations were down low, they had to rely on other sources of food. So they may have adapted this some of the sharks may have adapted this oceanic lifestyle, where they're going to some food resource in the mesopelagic zone, which is roughly 200 meters down to 1,000 meters, which is thought to have really an amazingly robust biomass of life that these sharks are tapping into at a predictable level. That would be my guess. Scott?
Any thoughts on why we have so many juvenile great whites around here?
We have a good mix. We have a good mix. We have juveniles, we've got subadults, and we've got adults. When a shark is about 8 to 9 feet in length, it's bulky and big enough to take out a seal. And so we don't see a lot of sharks less than that in terms of length, and when we do, we've seen them in Cape Cod Bay where they're out on the shoals and we think they're feeding on fish. The 8, 9, 10, 11, even 12 footers are still immature. Males don't mature until they're about 12 feet long, females until they're about 14. And so you'll have these juveniles that have the capacity to attack and kill seals, so why not? So we'll see the mix of juveniles or subadults and the adults. Yeah.
When you were early in your research career, did you have any other phylas of marine animals that you're interested in studying, or were they always sharks?
Well, you know what? I was pretty lucky growing up. Although I grew up on Long Island Sound, my parents took me down to the Caribbean a few times, and I was torn between, and literally at one point in my life, torn between coral reef fish ecology and sharks. And so I was volunteering for this lab, and I told you I got hired by that lab. I was set to spend my last semester at the University of Rhode Island down in the Caribbean, studying coral reefs, when the job offer came. And I was torn. I said, do I go with sharks and actually get paid, a pittance, but get paid to do it? Or do I go down and play around with coral reefs and do that the rest of my life? So I was really torn, and so I decided to go with the shark thing. But yeah, I did. I still love coral reefs, and now I'm really lucky to study sharks on coral reefs. So I've combined the two, and my life's come kind of full circle.
I think there's a question.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't see you back there.
If we think the sharks follow the seals, when did we get the orcas?
Yeah, we've had reports of orcas, so it's intermittently over the years. I think Scott can talk to that, but yeah, and we don't think that's necessarily associated with the sharks or the seals for that matter yet. But one thing that we do know is that the only mortal enemy of a big white shark is the orca, and that's been demonstrated in South Africa as well as in California. Yes, sir.
Practical safety advice for surfers.
Practical safety advice. This is the loaded question. Yeah, no. Practical safety advice for surfers. So if you never ever want to take any chance whatsoever, you don't surf during those months, right? but also put it in the context of what is really the probability that you're going to get hurt. And it's really a low probability event. It really is. But if there's an area where that consistently has large numbers of seals, you might want to avoid that area. We talk a lot about periods of dawn and dusk being periods at which sharks feed. That's been demonstrated in some areas with some species, but not necessarily here with our white sharks. You know, although it's a general rule that's put out there by the towns, we don't have a lot of data to back that up. We're looking for those patterns in our data sets now, but nothing's jumping out at us in terms of anything tidal, anything in terms of time of day either. We know they're highly visual predators, so they rely very heavily on bright light. So there's not a lot we can give you yet to say, you know, I wish I could say, you don't want to go during a high tide on the south side of Nantucket, you know, when the moon is in, you know, retro, whatever, you know. We're not there yet, but we're hoping to get to that point. Okay.
Question?
Yeah.
You showed the shark off the coast where the seals were in closer. How close in will the sharks come? What depths is their limitation?
Yeah, I think that we tend to get fixated as humans on distance from shore, and what I've been trying to get the messaging out to the public is be more fixated on water depth. There are parts of Nantucket, the Vineyard, Outer Cape, where the water drops off very quickly, very close to the shoreline. Both victims in 2018 were in those kinds of areas. So think in terms of anything greater than 5 feet deep, and the white shark has access to. So that's why we're studying these troughs between sandbars. You know, you may see a sandbar out there, but if there's a way for the shark to get in, you know, into the trough between the two sandbars, the seals know the sharks are there. So the sharks have to challenge themselves to come closer to get to the seals. And some sharks figure that out, which means that you may be very, very close to a white shark and not know it. So I'm telling the lifeguards at these beaches, get a really good understanding of the topography of your beach. Understand where the holes are, you know, and how that changes with tide. But 5 feet is generally, we've seen white sharks in 6 feet of water.
Greg, what else are you finding in the white sharks' bellies besides seals?
Well, Spruce, we don't have that many dead white sharks, and the ones that have beached themselves have empty stomachs for the most part. But we do know, based on some isotopic signatures, biochemical signatures in their muscle and blood, that they feed on fish. They do feed on fish. And so a white shark is an opportunistic predator. If it's got the opportunity, even though I've seen them completely avoid those big schools of menhaden we've got off the Outer Cape, they just swim around them. When I would think that's an easy meal, but they will target other species of fish. But when they're tight to the shoreline, you know, a big fish does not want to be in shallow water. It's like a big boat, right? You don't want to be in super shallow water. And so when you do that, you're doing it, you know, you're taking a big risk. So there's got to be, it's a gamble and an energetic payoff. And so the energetic payoff is going to be, I'm going into that shallow water, which is a dynamic environment with tidal surges and currents and surf, because I know I can get a really good meal that's going to hold me over for a while. And so that's why they come close to shore. They're not targeting fish species close to shore because they don't have to come in that tight.
Is there an indication that sharks have any kind of sonar capabilities?
No, they don't have sonar, but they have electrosensory perception, which means they can sense electricity. Now, as soon as people hear that, they assume that they can sense electricity 4 miles away. And they can't. It's a very near-field sense. Extremely low levels, but the threshold really, really low, but it's got to be close. So a shark will be able to detect its prey, if it's alive, when it gets within about a meter of it. And so when a white shark is in full attack mode, what it does is it rolls its eye back because it's not going to rely on its eyesight anymore. It's going to rely on its electrosensory perception to locate its prey. Really cool. Yeah.
So is it true that most of when a shark bites a human, it's often a juvenile that's making a mistake, or did I make that up?
No, there have been a few scientists that have said that. I don't think there's a lot of data to support it. I'm often quoted as saying, if I studied shark attack, I'd go out of business, because from a statistical point of view, it's really difficult to find trends in very small data sets. If I studied car accidents, and believe me, that's what people do. That's how we come up with what we call insurance rates, right? You have a robust data set, and you can look at calculate risk. When it comes to shark attacks, there's so few reports that are really reliable. How big was the shark that bit you? What was its species? When and where did it occur? All that stuff. These are really poor data sets. And so there have been scientists, particularly in 2018, and one of them was a friend of mine, said, well, they were probably juvenile sharks because they don't have a lot of experience. Well, he may or may not have been correct, but I know he doesn't have much data to back that up. Sadly. Yes, sir?
Are there any studies being done now that would actually scare them away, some sort of electronic pulse? Is anything working?
Yeah, there are a lot of new, I talk about technology a lot because I've lived from, through an incredible phase in electronic development. But there is definitely a whole bunch of technologies that have been proposed to folks on the Cape, beach managers, town managers, select people, a sense to give, all the new technologies that might deter sharks, none of which have actually been proven to work. Particularly in Cape Cod, and all of which are very expensive. But electronic fencing, magnetic fencing, all these things have been proposed. Early warning, early detection systems, early warning sonar, underwater sonar systems. They've all been tested in a couple of areas and showed some promise, but none of which have really proven to be 100% effective. And so the towns, you get a lot of grumbling from the ocean community, and I understand that. They want some measures to be taken right away, but the towns are really nervous about implementing anything that's not going to be effective because they don't want to give the public, and I sense this is for liability issues, they don't want to give the public a false sense of security. And so these technologies exist, but nobody's willing to really try them yet.
Are there any studies for seal patterns on why they're here now?
I love the question because it's one that Scott and I talk about a lot. I'm studying half the equation, right? I'm studying the predator, and I can only get so far with that. I need to know more about what the prey is doing, and there's a group of scientists composed of the federal government, of Scotty's group, who are going out and trying to learn as much as they can about the seals. Now, what's really interesting about seals is that there's so many of them that there's not a lot of money around to actually support research. The research dollars are going to those species that are in serious trouble. So when you look at seals, you say, all right, we're kind of done with that. We've got that problem solved. Now we're going to go ahead and move on, to the North Atlantic right whale, which has not responded well. So, there are issues with funding, which means that not enough research is being done on the seals to get a sense of what their patterns look like, which I think really need to be done.
Sorry to hog you again, Greg.
That's okay, that's okay.
Since they are very visual creatures, I don't know how long data loggers are tagged onto the sharks, but when they put out that light, does that negatively impact them or distract them in any way?
So far, we don't think so. Again, it falls back on you don't want to put something on the shark that's going to change its behavior. You don't want to put anything on a seal or an elephant or anything you're studying. You don't want to modify the behavior. There's a bunch of wonderful Far Side cartoons of the bear coming home with 7 tags on it, and the wife standing there like this, We're going to wrap things up, but so far there's no indication that when the light goes on, it changes the behavior of the shark, but we're looking for that.
Good timing.
And the lights came on, so I'm going to wrap it up.